first speaker will explain the basic principles of the Austrian school. That is Professor Nentjes. And I hope you will enjoy the discussion. I give the floor first to Alasdair. He is going to introduce Andries Nentjes, and from there on the conference will start. Thank you.
It is therefore my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Nentjes, have I pronounced it right? Professor Nentjes, who is an emeritus professor in economics and public finance at the University of Groningen, and his topic is going to be an introduction to the Austrian School of Economics. Professor Nentjes.
Well, what is the Austrian School? A college of thought in economic science. It's certainly not mainstream. But it is really venerable and old, you could say, because it has a history of 140 years. It started 140 years ago, so in the last half of the 19th century, in Vienna, in the University of Vienna, with 3 professors, and the names Menger, Karl Menger von Wieser, and von Böhm-Barwerk. When you come in Vienna and you go to the university at the Ring, and you go in the university and you come to the inner court, you will find there their names and plaquettes commemorating that these 3 are really the Grundlegers, or the founding fathers of the Austrian school in economics. Now, Austrian originally was a kind of nickname. The German economists of the German historical school came up with it, so this is Austrian, but in the end it became a nom de guerre, so they, and that's the same. And also, of course, Austrian economics, but Austria, we should not think, of course, in 1870 or 1880 about the Austria of today, but about this whole donor monarchy, which ended up to deep in the Ukraine and deep in Poland. Hungary was included, and the largest part of the Balkan. Even this great economist, Ludwig von Mises, whose name is attached to this institute, came himself from what nowadays is Lov. I think the German name was Lemberg, so it is a place in the Ukraine. So it was not that small as that. But, well, the Austrian school, it's now in its 4th generation, as we will see, and it's no longer Austrian, it has in the time become global, I think, and with strongest attachments probably in the United States. Now, I had to make a choices for this talk, and I decided that I would focus on the political implications of the Austrian theory, and not so much about the theory for itself, but more about its political implications. Now, I've got in here the Austrian school, and it should not come to you as a surprise. It's pro-market. It sees the market system as a self-adjusting system and self-repairing. You can, it may at sometimes be an unbalance, but you can compare it with a lifeboat. When a lifeboat capsizes, so it will come up again, and that's, I think, to put it very sharply in Austrian view, the economy. It's also self-repairing, it's an evolving system, it's a survival of the fittest systems. So if there on the way things wrong, it tends to repair itself. I think that's very strong and very much in the work of Hayek. Then the Austrian school is pro-core state, so the core state is then basically the state providing safety internally, externally, and the rule of law. And actually, such a core state, the rule of law, is the base, is necessary for a market economy. You need property law, for example, it's very clear. You need contract law, but even family law is full of these economic characteristics which you need as an orderly framework for the market economy. Now, from all this flows that the Austrian school is critical of the welfare state, so this whole set of insurance and services of a type which, in the Austrian view, can better be provided by the market. Then it's liberal and neoliberal, liberal in the political sense, of course, in pro of these basic political freedoms, and neoliberal, and also in economic sense, pro-free trade, and so on. Then, and I will go on along that line, it's clear that the Austrian school is critical of Marxism and Keynesianism, so there are different, clearly different political views implied, but they are also critical of modern, and that may become somewhat as a surprise, they are all critical of modern neoclassical mainstream economics. Though I have to go back. Oh. I have to go back. How was that?
Try page up. Where is page up? I don't know. Try that.
Yeah, thank you. That's good. So here you have a quick view of the 4 generations of Austrians. It begins with the first generation, so mainly working, say, in the period 1870 until 1920. Karl Menger, Friedrich von Wieser, and again von Böhm-Barwerk. Then the second generation, there we see Ludwig von Mises, and he is a very important figure in the sense that he is the link between the first generation, he was the pupil of von Wieser and von Böhm-Barwerk, and the link to the next generation. So actually, von Hayek is very much a pupil of von Mises, and Israel Kirchner, much later, took his lectures also from Ludwig von Mises and became his pupil. And you see, if you want to get old, it's better to become an Austrian, because all these people have been grown until deep in the 1980s, in the 80s and in the 90s, and they even went up with very good work until the end. So that might be perhaps an incentive for some of us here, hoping that it is not too late. So Ludwig von Mises is of course an important figure. Friedrich von Hayek is an important figure in the sense that they developed Austrian theory further. In the third generation, I think Israel Kirchner stands out as an economist first developing Austrian theory. Then we are in the fourth generation. Well, I put 3 names for every generation, could have been much more. And for the fourth generation, it's really difficult to make a choice because, well, I think it has to be crystallized out who would be then who would have to be there. But this as a quick look. And what I will do now is I will tell you something about Karl Menger, von Böhm-Barwerk, von Mises, Hayek, and so these will, I think, be the main figures for discussions. And the work of the others will be implicit there. So, what I had planned to do then was the Austrian school and its battlegrounds. So first against Marx, against Marxism, against communism, socialism, and the welfare state. Then, so that is a battle of 140 years old. Then the battle against Keynes, and all later strands of Keynesianism, you may call it neo-Keynesianism, post-Keynesianism, the new Keynesian economics, and so on. So these are really political and analytical battles. And then there is this battleground with modern neoclassical mainstream economics, and it's mainly analytical, and I think also for the sake of time, I will not have much to say about that today. If you want, it can be a point for discussion. So then let us start against with Marxism. And Karl Menger against Marx. Karl Menger wrote this book in 1871, and in a sense he came with a kind of criticism which actually you find only very later on, later on in the work of Karl Marx in Das Kapital. Now let's begin, just for a summary, with Karl Marx. What he basically says is that the laborer creates value by producing goods. Now, this laborer does not get paid out the full value of his work. For example, he works for 10 hours per day, and he gets paid only for 6 hours per day, and the capitalist takes 4 hours of him. So he is exploited, and in the view of Marx, this kind of exploitation would increase over time, and in the end, the capitalist system would collapse by that. Menger, and he was very young, at the age of 30 years, he wrote his Principles of Economics, 1871. That's a totally different view. He says, well, you create value by satisfying the consumer. So value is how the consumer values the product. And starting from that point of view, you go back, you look at the inputs in the product, and Menger points out that the value of the inputs, say labor, capital, natural resources, that they are based on how much these inputs contribute to the product. So the value of the product, and that is the value in the eyes of the consumers, is imputed to the inputs. So the inputs are paid according to their contribution to value. And if you now look again at labor and the price of labor, and you ask why is the price of labor so low, then the conclusion is here, that is because the contribution of labor to creating value is so low. Not exploitation, it's simply a low contribution. Now, that of course, I tell this perhaps in a bit exaggerated way, but basically this is still very much in the neoclassical economics of today, this basic idea that it is in the end the value for the consumer, which determines what the value of the inputs is. Then you might ask, well, what could we do to improve the position of the laborer? Well, Bernard, in his theory of capital, gives an implicit answer to that. And we start with the second bullet point. He says, saving is postponing consumption. It's not consumption. And if you do that, if you save, if you postpone your consumption, you want a compensation for that. So interest is a kind of, you could call it a reward. You can also say it's compensation for bringing sacrifice. Now, savings are invested in capital goods. And such investments in capital goods are increasing output. That's clear. They are also increasing the productivity of labor. That's what, if you read this work, it's completely out that capital investment in capital goods raises output, but included in that is raising the productivity of labor, and as a consequence of that, in the end, wages can also go up because of their higher productivity. And what comes out as a conclusion, the last bullet point, what we see is not capitalist exploitation of labor, but basically there is a harmony of interest of labor and of capital. If the capitalist saves, then the laborer benefits by having higher wages. And against that is at the heart of today's neoclassical economics. So it comes very much from the Austrian as an original contribution, but you find the same ideas, for example, in the work of Marshall, and you find it, if you read well, you could even find it in the textbooks of today. Also, it's then often told in a somewhat different way. So this then, of these two founding fathers, Menger and von Boehm-Bawerk, in their battle with Marx and Marxism, and it really made, especially the work of Boehm-Bawerk, it made an impression on the early socialists and communists, and it even altered their actions. But I'll skip that because I go through history in very big strides, and we are now in 1920, so we are now at the second generation. We are at the moment that the capitalist system has been overthrown in Russia. There is a socialist economy in the making, and the question is, well, will that work? How could that work? Von Mises was one of the very first just to look at that problem and to think and write about it. Well, he says the characteristics of a socialist economy, the basis of a socialist economy is public, collective ownership of means of production. So that is the, of course, well, the basic struggle of Marx. So one, collective ownership of means of production, and two, that is also part of it, a centrally planned production and distribution. And now my story will be a bit, not match directly with the text, just to make it always go a bit faster. Now, is such a socialist economy feasible? Now, the consequence of having no private property is that people have no inputs of their own, because everything is private property. If you have no means of production to sell, there will be no market and there will not be price for inputs. If you cannot sell these inputs, you will not have an income. And if you have not an income, you will not be able to buy, you cannot be a buyer, so there will not be a market for outputs and there will not be a price system for outputs. And then the question is, how will this planner then plan? For example, to put it very simple, he has to decide whether he should produce in a very capital-intensive way, or whether indeed, for example, to come to full employment, he should produce in a very labor-intensive way. What is the best way to do so? Well, in a market economy, you have, of course, the market which takes care that in the end, the available labor is supplied and is used, and that the available capital is used. Well, in this centrally planned economics, such signals are missing, and basically, this planner has not the information to take his decisions. So he makes decisions, but he has to do it basically more or less in the blind. The same for output. If he has to plan output, well, what kinds of outputs should he make, and what qualities, and how much of each? And this again on the assumption that he really tries to satisfy the consumer. That is the aim of the planner. Then again, there are no prices of output, he has no price signals, and again, he has to plan in the blind. That is the story of Mises, reduced to its essentials. There has been a follow-up of very long discussions about these issues. I think if we do look what in the end came out of the socialist systems, then the only conclusion is that really it has turned out that they are, in terms of economic performance, inferior to this market system. So in this sense, I think there can be little doubt that the Austrians have history on their side in this battle about how socialist economist functions can. How socialist economies can function. Of course, they can function. You can produce, but look what the position is of the consumer. Then this goes quickly. This is Hayek. He looked at the political side of socialist economists. And of course, in 1944, he was looking at Russia as it had developed under Stalin, and Germany, National Socialism, also a form of socialism, as it had developed under Hitler. And it led to his conclusion, well, it basically is socialist power in the hand of few, and the rest is it's a road to serve them. And by the way, it was Keynes, his opponent, who in 1944 wrote a short letter to Hayek and said, basically, I agree with you on this book. Then Austrians and the welfare state. Well, what we did get after the Second World War was not the socialist state. Also in the Netherlands, we have a research bureau. It was established in 1945, and it has the name still Centraal Planbureau, Central Planning Bureau. So it points out that some people perhaps had something else in mind for the Dutch economy than what it is nowadays. But what we did get was not a socialist economy. What we did get was the welfare state. It has been built up gradually in the period 1945 in most countries till late in the 1970s. So it is of course a market economy. It has a core state with a large public sector, and added to that the system of social insurance and social care. Now the key word of that system is solidarity. See it at the end of the first bullet point. Solidarity, it means, well, if you are in need, the group is there for you, you could say the state is there for you, and on the other hand, you contribute according to your capabilities. Now, to understand the Austrians and neo-Austrians' view of the welfare state, you have to look at what they say, of their view of human nature. And basic for them is that people are self-reliant and independent. Self-reliant means that as a person you can take care of yourself, and also independent means that you can decide for yourself. Now that is clearly a quite different focus from this strong focus on solidarity. And to make this long story here short, what the welfare state does, says the Austrian school, is that it frustrates people in pursuing their own ends freely, because everything has been arranged for you, and you haven't, in many cases, not even the free choice to decide for yourself what you want and what you don't want. And it also means that that is very basically Austrian, and I'm afraid I'm not able to talk long enough about this. It's very Austrian to say that advancement in society is the consequence of people looking for methods, for ways to improve their life, to discover new information. That's perhaps what you remember Hayek on, well, I will have something to say about this, about discovering information. So, in the Austrian view, building out the welfare state means that you are in for economic stagnation, because a way to improve society, to bring it further, to have economic development is frustrated by this extensive welfare state. So that is then especially what you read there in the bullet point number 4. So this is Hayek Constitution. I skip this. Let me then, other things will be shorter, say something about it. Market, because it is important. Hayek sees the market as a result of a kind of evolution. So the market system evolves. It has not been designed. It has been growing step by step by people who are looking for improvements for their own situation, also by making changes, and out of this, and the market has come, and it has been growing. And this process is going on. It is what he calls spontaneous order, and it is also clear if you have seen the work of Hayek that he is very suspicious of this so-called human design. So people coming together and saying, well, let us design society. We know how things should arrange. And he has pointed out, von Mises did it about the economic side, Hayek did it also about the political side. What we have seen, what can come out of this human design of society, really total failure. So the message here of Hayek is trust in this spontaneous order, which means that the less interference there is with this kind of order, the better it is. So this is then I think the line of thought. It is a real major line in the work of the Austrian school. It's better with. It started with Marx, with Marxism. The systems coming out of this, communism, socialism, and you can see the welfare state. You can look at the welfare state in different ways, but one way to look at it is to see it as a kind of outgrowth of this. Well, that's Marxism. Then we go for against Keynesianism. It starts here the story in the first decades of the 19th century, when at that time you were young and ambitious and economists, then the topic to choose was money and the trade cycle. And indeed, economists, Austrian economists of the second generation, were really among the pioneers in the monetary theory of the trade cycle. Von Mises in particular is one of the very first, and Hayek after him. Hayek was about 15 years younger than von Mises. The business cycle is then perceived as a cyclical movement about a normal level, and this normal level is the level where markets are cleared. So also where the labor market is cleared, so normal employment, or if you want full employment. Now the driver of this cycle is the creation of credit by banks. Banks make loans, and by this giving credit to entrepreneurs, they create money, increase the quantity of money, and this leads to overinvestment. Overinvestment in the sense that investment exceeds savings. It leads to a boom, so development is faster than it would have been without money. In that sense, this additional money gives flexibility. But it will end in a bust because increasing credit, increasing the money quantity, it cannot go on forever. At a certain moment, banks are at the limits. They have to reduce creation money. They may even come in a situation that they have to reduce their loans, and then we are in for a downswing. That is basically the Austrian theory of the so-called monetary overinvestment theory. Then Hayek added to that by linking this theory to the work of Bauer, and the essence it is that in the beginning of the boom, to create money, to create credit, banks lower the rate of interest, and this low rate of interest compared to the wage level says, well, capital is cheap, so if you are going for an investment project, make it capital intensive. Then the boom goes on, and we are in the second stage, and then banks have to raise the rate of interest because they want to reduce credit. Then the signal is reversed. It says, well, no, capital is not cheap, capital is expensive, and you expect it to make a profit with your capital-intensive project, but forget it, you are totally wrong. And then we are in a situation that the entrepreneurs cancel their investment projects, and that, of course, is the start of the downturn. So the real contribution of Hayek is that he makes a link, or that he says, last bullet point, that the bank's cyclical lending policy has two kinds of impacts. It has short-run impacts, so that's on production, on output, and on employment, but it has also a long-run impact, so on the capital structure. And that was actually the theory of the business cycle in the early 1930s. It was very clear that the Austrians, Hayeks, were in a leading position. That all changed in 1936 due to the Keynesian revolution. And through Keynes, I shall go through it quickly. If we want, we can, that can be point for discussion. What Keynes said was this, and he said it very loud and very clear: the financial system is inherently unstable. And as a source of this instability, he does not see bank creation, the creation of credit, the creation of money by banks, but the behavior of people investing in the security market. What he sees is that in the boom, in the stage of the boom, when security prices are going up, all these investors are going for the securities, out of money in securities. Prices go up. Then the downturn comes at the moment that opinion on the stock exchange is changing. People see that things are not going that well, and then the downturn sets in. Everyone is running out on the securities, is going into money. So, well, this would not so much be a problem if the financial was a sector apart, then there would be losers and there would be winners, and that was that. But actually, this spills over to the real economy in this period that share prices are going up, entrepreneurs are going for investment for the real investment in capital goods, and if the prices are down, they are going for they are reducing investment, and especially this downward boom. It got his attention in the 1930s more and more. He started with a kind of theory of the trade cycle, but as the boom prolonged, if you see the changes he made in this book, you see that he concentrated on these investments going down. Income goes down, consumption goes down, and because income goes down, savings also goes down, and then so he comes to the pronunciation that, well, investments are low, savings are low, and we are in a new kind of equilibrium, this underemployment, and there, of course, is the big difference with the Austrians. No cycling around normal level, but well, you start perhaps with a boom, and then you go down, and that's what he thought he saw in the 1930s. You are going down there, and there you end. So we have the lifeboat, it has capsized, and it doesn't come up. Or perhaps at some day it may come up, but then everyone will be drowned. So that was his message, and he brought it forward in a very alarming way. And he said it for the first time in the radio talk, but later on he also wrote it: the market economy is not self-adjusting. And there, of course, he was at loggerheads with the Austrian school. Now, the Austrian school, well, you know the Keynesian remedies, lower rates of interest, public investment, financed by the capital market. But the Austrians are against this, and the basic story is this one. It is bad economic analysis, they say. It focuses very much on the short-run impacts. A theory of capital, like Hayek developed, is lacking, and therefore long-run effects are not analyzed. Well, bad economic analysis inspires bad economic policy, and what the consequence of all this has been in the period after the Second World War is the short-run economic stimulation, used as a kind of general remedy to attain full employment. So there was only one problem: lack of effective demand, so stimulate the economy. As a result, structural defects in the economy are overlooked. There was not even an eye for that. And so we see in the end that we will have disastrous inflation, or as here in the 1970s, stagflation, which that brings us about the end, because we could go on at this long time. The question is, for the moment, where are we going? Well, after 1936, it looked for 30 to 40 years as if this Keynesian victory was complete and forever. And my precursor in Groningen wrote even in 1968 a quite sarcastical column on it, and gave it the title "Austrianism Turned Sour." So it indicates very much how people, but he was a real Keynesian, like that, how people were looking at the Austrian school as something like an underworld, the new underworld of economics. Well, that was the situation in the 1950s, 50s, 60s, but around 1970, since 1970, about 1970, that has been changing. In particular, it was Milton Friedman, I think, yes, he was the first with his monetary theory, rehabilitation of the quantitative theory of money. After that came the new classical economics, macroeconomics, the rational expectations theory, the so-called real business cycle theory, which tells that it will actually, it is a hair of the Austrian theory of the trade cycle. And also, that's in the same period that you see a revival and recognition of the Austrian school. That has, I think, very much to do with the Nobel Prize Hayek got in 1974. It was a very, probably unexpected recognition of the important, always lifelong important work he had done on the monetary theory, but also at the work on institutions after the Second World War. And it gave him a great impetus because he was by that time 74, it's the HIF, and then he started to write again, and he was very productive for the next 15 years. So he went on and spends for a large part also the self-examination. Now, that was the situation as it was developing. Then we had 2008, and if you read the newspapers of the great debt crisis, and you know that since then Keynes is back again, and so therefore I end with the remark that the battle rages on, perhaps to this evening here, and that is it, I think. So there was a chapter on the struggle with the neoclassical economics. It's not a political battle, let me say that about it. It's a battle about what is a good system of analysis. Well, if you know neoclassical economics, think of the microeconomics in the textbook. It's all very static, it's pictures. Demand, supply, price, and there it is, and there is equilibrium. Where does it come from? It isn't told. Consumer optimum, firm optimum, consumer optimum, iso-utility curves, that is a constraint, and again, there is equilibrium. So Austin thinks that's not very useful. They want a dynamic analysis, how do these situations come about, and in particular, how does the information, how is information created, how is it propagated. That is the story about these discrepancies. Well, it's not here, and so I think it's better now to leave it for this and restrict ourselves to these battles of the Austrian school with Marxism. I think this has been won, and then the battle with Keynes. Well, I think. My personal view about that is that both schools have to learn from each other, and I think it would be progress for economics if it could come to a real discussion. Much of what I have seen of the discussion between Keynesianism, and when I look not at Keynesianism as a political philosophy, but Keynesian analysis as a method of analysis, especially its analysis of the financial sector, I think it's as if, and you look, compare it with regards with the Austrian school, it is as if, well, what Kuhn wrote about paradigmas. You have different ways of looking at, you know, in the natural sciences, and people don't understand each other, and perhaps are not even ready to understand. That's very much the impression which I get from the discussions between Austrians and Keynesians in this respect. But possibly I'm playing now the role of the advocate for the devil, and that's what we will see in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Nentjes. My next speaker here is John Butler, who I've known for some time now. He is a practitioner insofar as he actively works in capital markets, apart from his various various degrees, and he's also an author. He's written a very good book, which I have read. I can recommend it, The Golden Revolution. He is an active fund manager, and particularly is active in real assets as opposed to paper assets. John, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Alasdair. I'll stand. I'll occasionally be pointing. No, that's okay, Alasdair. I'll occasionally be pointing to what's on the screen here. That said, I need to bring up the correct presentation, which I believe is located
On the desktop.
There you go.
There we go. Right. Yes, again, thank you, Alasdair. Thank you, Annette, for organizing. Thanks to the Ludwig von Mises Institute, the United Business Institutes, for the opportunity to speak to you today about the debt crisis. Not a day goes by that you read a newspaper, or go online, or watch the television, listen to the radio. The debt crisis has been in the headlines pretty much non-stop since 2008. And yet, that debt crisis, the one that we're surrounded by here in the Euro area, in Japan, in the United States, take your pick, that's not the crisis. The debt is not the crisis. It's part of it. It's a symptom of the crisis. The debt crisis, as they call it, has been misrepresented and misunderstood from the beginning. And so I'm going to take you back to the beginning and explain why, using an Austrian economics framework, as indeed I use day to day in my day job, and as I also employ in my book. In any event, we're going to discuss what debt is, where it came from, why it is a problem, even if it is not the crisis itself, and finally, how is this going to be resolved? How is this debt problem, how is this crisis the debt is associated with going to be resolved? I have some very clear ideas about that, although they may be somewhat controversial. So let's begin with what debt is. And I've taken a very simple definition here from, well, basically an economics textbook. I forget which one. It's Samuelson or some classic economics textbook. And it generalizes to the following. Debt is a contract between two or more individuals or entities to exchange money or something else, some other commodity, but of course normally money itself, at one point in time, usually starting now, but sometimes you have a forward contract, and then of course re-exchanging that at some future point in time. And then interest payments are frequently made in the interim, although that need not necessarily be the case. Now historically, debt, as a general term, has been characterized in two distinct ways. And I think it's very important to understand this distinction as we work to understand the debt crisis. Now, those two types of debt are short-term credit, or circulating credit, you might call, that extinguishes itself automatically as goods are produced and consumed. And then there is longer-term debt, which is issued in order to develop the capital stock, to grow the capital stock, to build the capital goods that will have a long lifespan and provide for consumption goods over a prolonged period of time. The two are very different. Short-term, self-extinguishing credit to finance consumption, long-term debt to finance investment. Let's keep these definitions in mind as we move through this discussion of debt. And next stop, where did it come from? I mean, I'm sure that there is at least one person in this room, but you don't need to say who you are. I'm sure there is at least one person in this room who did not believe that the debt accumulation of the past few decades was a problem until 2008 or 2009. I'm sure there's at least someone out there who just didn't regard it as a problem. And yet, when you look at long-term charts of debt, and in this chart I'm dividing debt up into the sort of original G7 economies, the broader G20 economies, and then there's even a time series here for emerging markets that have not yet been included in the G20 countries. And you notice something very important here. You notice that the 1970s was the low point for accumulated debt in both the old G7 and the newer G20 economies. Now sure, you had the wartime debts. You see the spikes to pay for World War I, World War II, but then notice the long downtrend, the debt reduction that took place into the 1970s. Now, the Keynesians have some difficulty explaining why this ongoing reduction in debt did not lead to a chronic recession. Because, according to standard Keynesianism, that should have led to chronic underemployment, weak growth. Well, it didn't. It didn't. And in fact, a very important point to make is that as you went down, as you reduced that debt, in fact, what happened as the debt was being reduced, growth was unusually strong. And then, curiously, from that bottom reached in 1970, something else would happen. We're going to get there in a moment. First of all, regarding that debt has increased subsequent to 1970. Well, we saw the debt go up and up and up since 1970. Why? Well, first of all, let's think about that debt and the function it's been serving in society. Well, we know that as the debt was accumulated, it eventually got to the point where there was, well, too much of it, right? We had a debt crisis in 2008. We had this bottom in debt in 1970, but thereafter it just went up and up and up, and now we find ourselves in a crisis where everyone worries that the debt is unserviceable. Well, how on earth did that happen? You know, where did this come from? Where did all this debt come from if it was so low back in the 1970s? Well, one explanation is offered by the economic mainstream, which is that markets are unstable. Markets make mistakes. Markets do things they're not supposed to do. Markets misallocate resources. In other words, the debt is a result of basically money illusion. That is, as interest rates trended lower in the 80s and 90s, everybody borrowed too much. Interest rates were low, we were able to finance more debt, so we borrowed too much, we overinvested, and that's why we have a debt crisis, money illusion. And also associated with that are wealth effects. Not only was debt easier to service as interest rates came down, but interest rates coming down supported stock market valuations, supported property valuations, and this created a wealth effect. Everybody felt wealthy, so not only was debt inexpensive, but at the same time, everyone felt as if they could afford more debt because they were becoming wealthier. And so it was just assumed that stock markets would always go up, interest rates would always stay low, and everything would be fine. And indeed, this set of assumptions, arguably does help to explain why Greece, for example, got into the mess it's in today, and certain other extremely over-indebted euro area economies. In Spain, you had a big housing bubble, for example, which is almost certainly, at least partially, a result of money illusion and wealth effects. Now, the Austrians have some sympathy for this. In principle, after all, economic actors are imperfect. Everybody makes mistakes. Of course, every once in a while, somebody borrows too much, or somebody feels wealthy temporarily, only to see their wealth decline at some point in future. But the Austrians go much, much farther in understanding debt dynamics, public and private. In particular, Austrians understand the importance of property rights. Now, private sector actors, when they make mistakes, they lose money. Corporations that make mistakes go bankrupt. Individuals and households that make mistakes might also go bankrupt. At a minimum, they see their wealth decline. But does that happen to public entities? Public entities effectively represent a commons. Governments represent a debt commons. Governments can issue the debt, but of course it is ultimately the households and the corporations, the private sector entities, through the tax system, that must service the debt. And the Austrians understand this as a classic tragedy of the commons. It's not market failure, it's property rights failure. Because no private entity is on the hook for that debt directly. They're only required to service it indirectly. And so you get into these very negative game dynamics where everyone is out to try and benefit as much as possible from the debt, and yet to service it as little as possible. So the Austrian understanding of how we ended up with such a huge debt burden is somewhat more robust. But on with that, it's not just a lack of property rights that Austrians recognize. It is also what Professor Nentjes already discussed, which is that the welfare state creates a mentality that not only is it economically rational, given the lack of property rights, to maximize your benefits and minimize other people's, but at the same time, that this is somehow morally correct. This concept of positive rights, that we simply are born to deserve education, healthcare, pensions, disability benefit, who knows what it might be, without asking the question, who is going to provide it? At what cost? Why shouldn't they get to choose how much they'll charge for providing us those services? Austrians ask these important questions, and they understand that the entire mentality of a welfare state contributes to this tragedy of the commons. And finally, in worst cases, and I'm not going to mention any countries by name, you can use your own imagination, you end up with what I would call a system of public sector control fraud. James Buchanan won the Nobel Prize in Economics for talking about, or conceiving of, and developing public choice theory. And he demonstrated how public choices are, in many cases, if not all, made in ways that are structurally less economically efficient than private sector choices. And it's related to some extent to what I've already mentioned, but Buchanan formalized it into a school of thought and won a Nobel Prize for it. That is, you actually get public sector entities acting more in their specific interests rather than the true interests of society at large. So these are ways to understand where the debt came from, other than just the fact that it's been rising steadily since the 1970s. But now hold on a moment. I told you earlier the debt wasn't the crisis. The debt was a symptom of the crisis. So why is the debt a problem? Think about what Professor Nentjes already said about the work of the Austrians in understanding how capital comes into existence, how it is allocated and reallocated over time according to important market pricing signals. Guess what? Growth in the G7 economies has been in a downtrend ever since the 1960s, through the 70s, through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. Didn't we notice? Didn't we notice that growth has been steadily declining on trend for over 30 years? Has no one been paying attention? So let me get this straight. We've been increasing our debt burdens at the same time. For some reason, our economies have been growing at a slower and slower rate. This did not begin in 2008. This began in the 1970s. Why? Why? We'll get there, I'll explain a bit more. But that's why the debt is a problem, because it's a growth crisis. Resources have been so chronically misallocated for so long, they have not enabled a healthy rate of growth to be sustainable. And the debt that has been accumulated alongside is simply a symptom of that. Now, here I'm looking at things country by country, where you can take your pick. It's difficult to read this slide, I'm sorry, but I've got the entire G7 here, as well as a couple of other countries. And what you see is that debt levels, of course, through the years, have been growing everywhere. But the other thing you see is that following 2008, notwithstanding all this talk about debt reduction, austerity, and so on, please show me one economy, just one, that has actually made material progress reducing its accumulated debt, public and private. Oh, sure, there's been lots of shifting around. Lots of debt has been moved from one place to another. For example, public sector entities have assumed a lot of debt from the private sector. So you've had a lot of debt substitution. You've also had a lot of accounting hocus pocus that has reclassified debt in various ways. You've had guarantees applied across borders, as if that somehow changes the nature of debt into something it's not. Deleveraging has not been taking place. True sustainable debt reduction has not been taking place. What's been taking place is a great accounting shell game. The reason why the debt is not being reduced and is not being extinguished is because growth is insufficient to allow that to happen. And indeed, this is really the mess we're in. This is really why it's a problem. And just before I move on to the next step, sometimes people say that the United States is doing better than the Euro area, better than Japan, better than the UK. Well, it really depends on your definition of better. Because the fact is, when you look at the United States specifically, yes, the private sector has made some progress towards debt reduction. But I hate to say this, the amount of debt reduction in the private sector still leaves that debt at a level which is huge in a longer-term historical comparison. So fine, you've made a bit of progress, but still, by any reasonable historical measure, the US economy is still nearly, the private sector, is still nearly as leveraged as it ever was. That's number one. And number two, what you also see in the chart here is the tremendous degree of public sector debt substitution that has taken place. Now, that's a problem. It's not just a problem that the debt isn't being reduced. I will go one step farther, and I will say that the substitution of public for private sector debt is a problem too. Why? Well, think about it. What is debt supposed to do? Debt is not circulating credit. Debt is not meant to finance consumption. Debt is meant to finance the capital stock. It is meant to grow the capital stock, reallocate the capital stock. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't that mean that in a way debt should be productive? If debt is not intended to finance consumption, but rather to finance the growth of the capital stock, shouldn't there be a relationship between the growth of debt and the growth of that capital stock? Well, of course there should be. Now answer me this. Where historically has debt been more productive in growing the capital stock? When that debt has been incurred by private sector entities, or when that debt has been incurred by public sector entities? And the answer to this is obvious. If you look at long-term historical charts for a wide variety of economies, the marginal productivity of private sector debt is superior to the marginal productivity of public sector debt, which is really just another way of saying that other factors equal, private sector entities tend to use their capital in ways that are more productive to society than public sector entities. And rather than get into an elaborate discussion of why, consider again the property rights issues that we discussed a moment ago as a possible explanation for that. So the marginal productivity of debt, which has already been declining for many years now, debt's gone up, growth has gone down, that shows declining marginal productivity. I believe this problem will only be exacerbated now by the substitution of public sector debt for private sector debt. Now, that is a simple, brief explanation, Austrian explanation as it were, of what debt is, where it has come from, and why it is a problem. Now, let's consider, how is it going to be resolved? And I think it's important to understand that the crises that we are seeing in various locations around the world do give us a few hints as to how it might be resolved. Let's consider those. Well, for example, in the euro area, we've already seen some defaults, or if you want to call it not default, but call it reorganization, restructuring of debt. This we've already seen happening. We've seen it in Greece, we've seen it in Iceland, Ireland, and Cyprus. We've seen various forms of debt restructuring. Don't get me wrong, they're all a bit different, but they bear certain things in common. There have been actual, formal, legal steps taken to restructure these legacy debts that have been swelling for many decades. But then think about what's been happening elsewhere. Think, for example, about what you've seen in the UK, or Japan, or in the US. Has there been any meaningful effort in these countries to come to terms with the overall growth of debt? Or, for example, are they dealing with it in another way entirely? Well, for example, as we know, the UK, Japan, and the United States have all seen their central banks explode in size ever since 2008. Their balance sheets have expanded very rapidly as they have created reserves. They're buying up the government debt. They're effectively monetizing it. I know that's a difficult word for some people, but in practice, this is what is happening. They're going down a different road. It's not the road of restructuring, it's the road of inflation. Now, take a look again at these countries I've just categorized. The ones that have gone through the debt restructuring are going through economic deflation effectively in their domestic economies. Whereas the ones that have not gone down that road, well, they're creating money at a very rapid rate. And indeed, in the UK, for example, inflation has been very high over the past few years as a result. But now wait a minute. Think again, more subtly. In Greece, Cyprus, and say the Portugal, for example, other Euro area countries in crisis, these are the countries that do not have their own central bank. They don't have their own printing press. In every instance of a country with this debt burden that does have its own central bank, in all cases, they are growing their balance sheets, they are going down the road of inflation. As a result, this substitution of private sector into public sector debt only increases the likelihood that there is going to be an inflationary endgame to the debt crisis rather than a deflationary endgame. Because those who are accumulating the debt problem are the ones who own the printing press to inflate their way out of it. And I think this is another important distinction to make. Now, I've written a book about this endgame. And I've also written several articles about it. And this is the problem. Some people think that you can simply inflate your way out of debt, and that basically extinguishes the debt, that solves the problem. Well, yes and no. Remember, it's a growth crisis. The debt's a symptom. And in fact, if you take a look at history, and if you apply a little game theory, you come to a somewhat different conclusion. It's going to be very, very difficult for all of these indebted countries to inflate their way out at the same time. And just a brief quote from an article that was published recently in the Gold Standard Journal. I make this point. If everyone's inflating, if everyone is seeking to devalue their currencies, who will be left holding depreciating dollars, or euros, or sterling, or yen for that matter? And if fewer and fewer countries are accumulating these chronically devaluing currencies, how can they continue to be the primary currencies for settling international balance of payments transactions? The dollar is the world's premier reserve currency. As a result, countries like China that export a lot naturally accumulate a lot of dollars in exchange for those exports. But did you know China has not accumulated further dollar reserves since 2011? It has already been 2 years since China stopped accumulating reserves. What about other countries? South Korea has dramatically slowed its accumulation of dollar reserves. In fact, a number of central banks, countries, have slowed their accumulation of dollar reserves. But think about it. If dollar reserves are no longer growing, but everyone is still trading with each other, well, how going forward are they going to settle balance of payments transactions? If the trend continues, the dollar portion of reserves will continue to decline, as it has been declining for several years now. But what are all of these countries accumulating? What are nearly all central banks accumulating? They're accumulating gold. Why are they accumulating gold? Well, they're not accumulating it because it's a barbarous relic, as Keynes said. They're accumulating it not just to replace dollars in their reserves, but currencies at risk of devaluation generally. It's simply not possible for all countries to devalue their currencies against everyone else. And so again, ask yourself the question, as China, as South Korea, and as other countries slow their rate of currency reserve accumulation, but have increased their rate of gold accumulation, guess what eventually happens? When you need to settle those balance of payments, guess where the bulk of your reserves end up residing? They reside in gold. The dollar share declines, the euro share declines. And now think about game theory for a moment. As the dollar share declines and the gold share increases, countries start to look at each other. Think about your exporters. If I export and I accumulate currency reserves that are being devalued, well, at some point, I might really aggressively try to stop that. But what about other countries? They'll have to take up the slack. What if they won't take up the slack? For every country that chooses to slow its accumulation of dollar reserves, there is a country that must accelerate its accumulation, or the dollar share of reserves declines. That's the game theory dynamic. And eventually you get into a situation where nobody wants to accumulate dollar reserves, or possibly euro reserves, or yen reserves, because they'll be the last country doing it. And if you're the last country doing it, you'll end up holding only depreciating reserves, and everyone else is going to get the gold. If you connect the dots and look at history, this process of dollar reserve reduction, of currency reserve reduction generally, combined with gold reserve accumulation, unleashes a game theory dynamic that eventually will take you back to some form of gold standard. That will resolve the debt crisis. Now, it may seem a big leap, but here's a key quote from my book. Lacking both a national fiat currency alternative to the dollar and also the requisite cooperation to move towards a global currency, such as the SDR basket, it's clear what sort of regime is going to replace the dollar. Some form of gold standard. It's the only solution, and it's the only way to truly extinguish the debt. Keep in mind, even inflation doesn't truly extinguish debt. The debt's still there, it's just being inflated away. But if you actually end up exchanging gold to extinguish debt, that's true extinguishment of debt, because the gold has no liability. It is just a substance. To truly extinguish debt requires that you exchange that debt for something that has value above and beyond the ephemeral, arbitrary confidence of pieces of paper printed arbitrarily and backed by nothing. That's where we have to go to solve the debt crisis. And again, I believe regime dynamics and game theory will take us there in time. Just a quick word to close. I've said nothing about the morality of all of this, but I think there is an ethical side to it. And indeed, there's a strong ethical element of the Austrian School of Economics, even if it is not the one that is most talked about. But basically, it is a precept of ethics, I think generally, that voluntary action is morally superior to coerced action. That which we choose to do voluntarily, I think most people agree, acquires a stronger moral aspect than that which is coerced out of us. But if that's true, then go back to the tragedy of the commons created by public debt. Debt incurred by individuals or private entities fully responsible for servicing that debt themselves without recourse to anyone else, that's voluntary debt incursion. Whereas when the public sector entity accumulates the debt, is that truly voluntary? Does someone truly own it? Does someone truly own the negative economic results if it ends up in a crisis? No. It's a tragedy of the commons. It's a failure of property rights. And so really, I think you have to look at the debt crisis in this way. It is also a moral mistake where we've ended up. Now, look, there may be situations where incurring public debt is entirely morally justified. Say to provide for defense in the event of aggression against a country. You've got to finance defense somehow, perhaps. Certain types of public infrastructure, you might say, are important common goods. I'll stay out of that debate, but I'll put it out there for now. I'll just say that some Austrian economists, such as Hayek, for example, but also some semi-Austrian economists like James Buchanan, demonstrated, I think, quite convincingly that public debt and to finance public infrastructure is easily abused. And finally, I'll close with this comment. Hayek's Road to Serfdom, one work among many that contributed to his receiving the Nobel Prize in the 1970s. I would go so far as to argue the road to serfdom is paved with public debt. And I think a main reason why we're in the mess we're in with respect to the debt crisis is because, indeed, we are on that road to serfdom, and we have been for some time. And I think we need to take Hayek's warnings very, very clearly in that regard. So, thank you very much. I hope you found that interesting, and I believe we have some time for questions. So, thank you.
So, are there any questions? Question there.
First of all, I want to thank both the speakers.
Introduce yourself, please.
Okay. My name is Greg Simon. I'm an independent investor and student of Austrian economics. I want to thank both speakers for an excellent presentation today. I run in my spare time an independent blog, and one of my readers has a question for John today, if you want me to read it. What would be a realistic time frame for moving back to the gold standard, in your opinion? And try and explain as best you can what it will be like for the ordinary man and woman in the street immediately in the aftermath. And I think that behind this question is a lot of people who don't have any gold are concerned if we move to a gold standard, how can they benefit from that change in the monetary regime?
Yes, well, the first part of the question on time frame, it's one of those things. Now, if you look at the way the original gold standard came into existence, it did not come into existence as a result of a conference. It did not come into existence as a result of diplomatic or any direct government initiative. In fact, it came into existence from the bottom up. and arguably the most important authority today on the origin of the classical gold standard is Professor Giulio Gallarotti. And he makes it very clear in his book that it really was spontaneous. It really occurred spontaneously from the bottom up, because people simply wanted to settle debts and settle balance of payments transactions in gold. And I think, based on what I said, I think it will unfold in a similar way this time around. I think it will occur as a result of bottom-up actions by various actors. They will include governments, however. And I believe in terms of timeline, this is going to sound a bit of a silly answer, but I think it could happen at any time. That said, I don't think it will happen tomorrow. I think it will happen at any time. What needs to happen is simply that one or two or a handful of exporting countries get nervous enough about accumulating additional currency reserves and simply say, we will no longer accept anything other than gold or other liquid, real, tradable substance in order to settle balance of payments. So for example, the oil producers, one or more oil producers say, we're still happy to sell oil, but we'll sell it for gold. Or certain other real assets that we know cannot be arbitrarily devalued. And for what it's worth, the BRIC countries have already made certain indications also that they're very dissatisfied with current international monetary arrangements, and they don't trust the indebted countries to deal with their problems through structural reform. They're concerned they will deal with them through inflation. And the BRICS are getting more organized all the time, so it's possible that they will also act in this regard at some point in the future. End of this answer is, I would be surprised if it takes us more than 5 years to get there. I would be surprised, based on history. And then finally, just quickly, what can you do to prepare for this? Well, the good news is, if you actually create economic value, all that this means is you'll start getting paid in hard currency instead of soft currency. You'll get paid in something that cannot be arbitrarily devalued or inflated away. So for anyone out there who feels that what they do for a living adds genuine fundamental value to society at large, it doesn't matter that we're going back onto a gold standard. You'll still get paid for what you do. But what does matter is what you get paid will be hard currency that will retain its value over time. That is not a bad thing, it's a good thing. And for those who are frightened about a return to the gold standard, don't be frightened if you are a productive individual or you work for a productive entity. That's my simple answer to that.
Thanks very much. Next question. There's a question from the back there.
Okay, this question.
Sorry, can you say introduce who you are?
Sure. Hi, my name is Max Berry. I'm an economic researcher at EDEC, Risk Institute, EDEC is a university in France. Okay, so this question is also for Mr. Butler about the gold standard. Well, I want to ask. Well, two things. First, could you comment a bit on the recent change in value that gold just saw in the market recently, and well, how can anyone that wants to settle international accounts be sure that well the asset that they're trading to do that will not itself somehow change in value? And then, of course, the other question I want to ask is, when we go to a gold standard, what's to prevent deflation?
That's several questions. However, I caught all of them. Sorry, the first one again? I think I got the other two.
Okay, the first one is could you maybe comment on the changes value
Oh, yes.
the value of gold that has suffered in the market recently?
Right. Okay.
And what this means for
Well, I really have essentially no comment about that. I mean, look, financial markets are volatile. Commodity prices are volatile. They go up, they go down. If you take a look at the history of gold in recent years, it's gone up a lot more than it's gone down. Yes, it's gone down very sharply recently. It's gone down, in fact, it's gone down as sharply as it did, I think, in 1974. That's part of the answer to that question, I suppose. In other words, I think that as long as governments continue to favor printing money to deal with the debt problem, the price of gold will tend to trend higher rather than lower, just as it did in the 1970s when the United States and other countries dealt with economic difficulty by expanding the money supply. The second part, oh dear, the chain, sorry.
Deflation.
Excuse me, deflation.
Yeah.
Right, oh sorry, yes, of course. Deflation. Look, there was deflation throughout the period of the classical gold standard. The whole time. I mean, not every single year, but on average, right, from the 1870s through to 1914, there was deflation in prices. And that was because the money supply was relatively constant, because the gold supply was constant, and yet productivity growth was very, very rapid. Therefore, the supply of goods and services increased very rapidly. So the combination, of course, of more goods and services but stable money requires prices to decline. Good. I mean, please show me another multi-decade period in history when economic growth was as strong as it was, as from 1870 to 1914. I mean, that period is only 45 years long, that European GDP trebled or quadrupled. Not bad. And this occurred under a gold standard. If anything, I know people suggest otherwise, but if anything, that's empirical evidence that gold standards promote unusually strong, healthy rates of growth.
Thank you. One more question. Over there.
Yes, hello, my name is Patrick Smets. I'm the leader of the Libertarian Party in Belgium, which is very small right now. I apologize for my English, but my question is for Mr. Butler. In the 70s, when Friedman got his Nobel Prize, because he said that elevation of the monetary mass would bring inflation. Today, everybody knows that. I can talk about this with my butcher, or you know, as an investor, as everybody knows it, and everybody is protecting oneself against inflation, then you cannot get the inflation you are looking for. And at what time people would be afraid of an hyperinflation because they know how it works right now? They will ask another way out, and they will ask for a default or some kind of a default on the public debt rather than printing out of the debt. So do you have any scenario or how this could happen, or eventually you don't believe in it?
Well, I think actually Professor Nentjes might also have something to say about this, but I will offer a couple of quick thoughts and then hand over. Look, what is money? Are central bank reserves money? And the fact is, the only thing that's grown really dramatically since 2008 are reserves at the central bank, which of course is part of narrow money. But almost by definition, this type of money does not enter circulation, and as such cannot directly push up the price level. It does, however, change the way in which banks operate, because in theory they can draw on far more reserves in the event they choose to expand their balance sheets and lend more money. Of course, as banks do that, that increases broad money growth. But it's really only broad money growth that in the modern electronic banking world can have a large impact on the price level. So if you don't get broad money being created, it's very difficult to create a lot of price inflation. Now, again, it becomes a very technical argument, but my simple answer to why Friedman's money is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon and modern version of the quantitary theory of money, I mean, my simple explanation is that we just live in a world where broad money accounts for the vast bulk of transactions. Even back in the 1970s, cash transactions, physical cash, were still a very substantial part of commerce. They're much smaller today. So I think therein lies a lot of the explanation. But I believe that a lot of people take false comfort in thinking that it's impossible to create a lot of inflation, or somehow that central banks will fail to create inflation as a result of this that we're observing. The fact is, central banks and their regulators, politicians and so on, well, they can always change the rules if they want to. Well, this idea that they can't create inflation if they don't want to it's not true. Change the rules. Financial repression. Set all interest rates at 0. Set all private sector interest rates at 0. Let everyone borrow at 0%. Give away money for free. If you really want to create inflation, believe me, you can do it. Now, you'll destroy your currency in the process, but you can do it. Sorry, Professor Nentjes?
Do you have any thoughts on the lag between the production of raw money and the effect on prices?
Well, well, perhaps 2 points. I think a lot of this money disappears in the caches of banks just to improve their liquidity positions. And as long as that happens, it is not spent, and that cannot lead to inflation. That's one point. Another point is, and actually I must admit it is Keynesian, is that you get inflation at the moment that there is more money spent than there is goods are available. Now, if I look at the position, for example, of the Netherlands, capacity use is at 75%. So we are, and I think many countries in Europe are in the position that they are really, it's a large amount of overcapacity. So suppose that this money is used to spend on consumer goods and so on, then in the first instance we are, I think, in a situation that you would expect that production would go up, and just at the moment that more and more bottlenecks would appear, you would expect inflation. In any case, that these are the shorter impacts I see. So I leave that.
We are actually running a bit short of time, so we're going to change the order of events slightly, and we're going to bring forward the presentation of the Mises Award for a paper on the work of Ludwig von Mises and the relevance today. Now, making this presentation, I'm really delighted to have Herman de Croo, who has, I think, completed 45 years of public service in Belgium at all levels of government, from the very low to the highest state, and he indeed is a statesman. So, will you please give a big hand for Herman de Croo.
Thank you so much. I don't know if I'm inflammatory or deflammatory in politics. You are 45 years in Parliament, you are wondering about how many theories you have needed. And I remember the first period I was in government was education. And we tried, and very grateful to listen to this very excellent exposés, to do some things which is absolutely useful in a society. Try to teach youngsters what money is. They don't know it. And I'm chairing a parliamentary committee for the time being on the consequences of the financial crisis. And to my surprise, a lot of my fellow members of parliament were asking that elementary economics would be taught to young people. This is no more the case. That's the first thing. The second period I was in the government was in transport and infrastructure. And then the interest rate was 15% in the beginning of the 80s. And people didn't know what to do. We tried to create money, to inflate or deflate, to bring out of the crisis. And even the Belgian state, quite amusing, the Dutch state would never do that, was swapping public debt towards so-called weak currency, drachmas, liras, in the expectation that by unifying currency called the euro, the value of reimbursement would be the same as the value in which they bought those debts. But in the meantime, the interest of such weak currencies was so big that it could help to support the deficit of the budget. You see, split period. The third period I remember was at the Grand Montana debate in Monaco. in 2008, where the Director General of the International Monetary Fund was giving us to a small gathering, of 15 or 18, some people of responsible in their countries, saying that almost, exception one or two elements, the disaster of the crisis was coming. When I came back to the government, I told them in Belgium, I said, look, I heard very strange things. And I was telling that to the high responsible people of our national bank. They say, we misunderstood those things. And 2 or 3 months later, the mechanism of the subprimes, which in fact was an application of common law, in buying up real estate and trying to sell it back at a higher price. It's quite elementary. When you make a hypothèque, as we say, in our system, in the common law system, the lender gets the owner of the real estate. So you give much more money to the debtor, so it will crash. And then you have his property. And by reselling his property at an expected higher price, you make a double money. Now, at a given moment, the price of real estate didn't jump once again. And there we are. One of my friends is always saying, and you are a very brilliant economist, that we are now at the 117th crisis since Napoleon. Why are we panicking? But it's quite amusing to see all depth you are going and not trusting. You are in the value of the gold standard. That has happened. Hope is always something which has made religions survive during centuries. So it is all in the gold standard. But I'm not there for that. I'm just there to think the people attending those very interesting conferences, and perhaps even after so many years of Parliament, I was still taking 4 or 5 pages notes, just listening to both of you, which intensely, first of all, has 2 benefits. It keeps me awake, because I'm right. And the second part, if I'm hesitating over what I understood, I can pick up my notes and see what happens. But today, I would like to say that is my only job is to try to give an award to one of the openly present students. Is Christopher Hansen here? I hope he's there. Well, would you come to the front of this? Christopher Hansen is from Denmark, and he wrote a very interesting paper, which I hope one day will be published, on Mises on Money against monetary socialism. And it was a very interesting paper. I read it. It's not very long, so you are in a good field. Don't make papers longer than 4 pages. Otherwise, you need a business summary, and then you need the business summary, which is treason to the content of any article. It was of great interest. I don't know what is your formation, will explain that, and your training and your diploma and what your expectations are. But it's very good that for Mises and all the Austrian school, very glad, Professor, that you explained that once again to all of you, that you have the merit that also young people, having the spirit of the future, can deal with important and complicated issues. And perhaps before we can, or after, we can hand over the award, and I'm waiting when the award is somewhere, but with some peace I have to give it. Where is that? The award is lost. The golden standard is gone. So to be careful of that.
It was in plastic.
It's in plastic for me, for my eyes.
I put it there.
Oh, behind me.
No, I put it there.
Oh my goodness! It looks as a dollar, but it is money. May we still speak in euros? The president about inflation, but this Mises Award attains the sum of 1,000 euros and is attributed to you for an excellent paper on the work of Ludwig von Mises. And it is given, as I told you, to the young man next to me, and I will ask him as a duty before he can cash this one, to say a few words about his art. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for the award. I didn't know I actually had to read the paper to you, but I won't read it. I'll just say thank you for two very interesting discussions on Austrian economics and the current monetary system, and I'll say that I think that what is the basic problem today, and this is basically what I wrote in my paper, is that there is still one major bastion left of socialism in basically all of the Western world, indeed all of the world, which is monetary policy. And as I think Mr. Butler rightly said, any monetary system develops freely and voluntarily on the market, simply because it is the only way for it to be possible for such a development to take place. Yes. And I think that the longer we persist in the illusion that it's possible to centrally plan any monetary development, any monetary policy, we cannot hope for a lasting solution to the current problems.
Thank you. We are now sort of, I suppose, coming up to almost our 2 hours, and I think what I'd like to do, if I may, is to ask Professor Buffin to come and make some concluding remarks, and then we'll break for coffee. And I'm sure that anyone who has any questions, we will be around, and we would love to take them there. Professor Buffin.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to all of you to have attended this conference. This is the second annual conference organized by both the Ludwig von Mises Institute and UBI, United Business Institute, so it was again a success. Last year we spoke about the gold standard, and today the debt crisis. Of course, it's very much related, as you can understand it. I would like to thank Professor Nentjes for his presence today, Mr. Macleod, Mr. Butler, Start Minister Ramandopo, and of course, thank you and congratulations to the winner of this evening. Thank you again for the organization of this conference. Thank you, Mrs. Godard. You did almost everything for the organization of this conference. Thank you. And probably next year we'll have another conference. We are going to change the subject, but of course you will be invited again. Now, well, yes, you are asked to stay a bit with us just after the conference, because there is coffee and some drinks next door, and then of course the opportunity to chat with the speakers or between yourselves. Thank you very much again. Bye. I forgot to say about the votes.